Chapter 101, Territorial Wars, Part 1. Tourist City, 18 months prior. Inside a deluxe hotel room, a newlywed couple watched the worrying news on the television in the comfort of their bed. The tension between Eden and the Utah country is at an all-time high, the reporter said, and an image of thousands of soldiers marching was shown. They looked very disciplined and regal, meant to show the country's population that they, the military, could handle whatever results would come out of the discussions. The newscaster continued to speak. The Edenian military is preparing in case it develops negatively. However, our Foreign Affairs Minister Mathilde Ross will be flying to personally handle the talks. "Are you allowed to be here?" Althea asked, turning her fluffy, unruly head to the man she was lying on. "It is my week off," he told her succinctly, but his eyes were warm on the woman in his arms. His large hand slid down to her soft, unclothed waist, slowly caressing her supple skin. He had been looking forward to this for months. How could he forget that their honeymoon a few months prior was cut short because of a mission? Althea pouted and held his naughty hand in place. "But there are plenty of capable people in the military," he said, voice raspy and sexy, as he changed their positions and placed her underneath his hovering large body. Not forgetting to turn off the damned television, of course. He dipped his head so his lips touched the side of her face, slowly going down her neck, sampling her supple skin there. His warm hand moved, caressing her thigh, feeling her softness. Althea was frowning with a flushed face. She pursed her lips as he went lower, and she quickly placed her hand on his warm lips, stopping him from doing more. "Will Auntie be okay?" she asked, a bit breathless. How could she be in the mood when people she knew were in danger? "Gil led the team to protect her himself. They'll be okay," he said, kissing her palm. He couldn't tell her any more details because it was confidential, and he just assured things would be okay. However, his deep azure eyes met her lovely emerald ones, and he understood she was really not in the mood, for now. Sighing, he simply returned them to their previous position, with his wife snuggling comfortably on him. After confirming that he wasn't going to take advantage, so cute, Garen thought, her shoulders slumped in relaxation. She buried her head on his wide shoulder, wrapping her arms around him, feeling his soothing warmth. If only there were no wars. He looked at her gently, and his large hands caressed her back. He leaned down to kiss her head. "Only in an ideal world, my love," he said, wrapping his strong arms around her, sending her warmth. "But no matter what," he told her, "you have this husband of yours to protect you." 24 days of protection period. Althea rubbed her temple and walked to the lounge area and sat there. Her body felt very heavy, like Lade was resting on her. It wasn't even because she was pregnant. Brenda for a while just stood there looking down and waited for instructions. After a moment, Althea drank her tea habitually to calm her nerves. Not only did they have to deal with monsters, now they had to deal with other humans, too. Wait, no, there seemed to be other creatures. It was only after her cup was half empty that she noticed the other woman standing dutifully, not far from the circle. Althea sighed and waved at the other seat. "Take your seat and have a snack, it's cookies and tea." Brenda hesitated and looked at a loss. Althea's eyebrows rose, puzzled. "What's wrong?" "It's improper to be so informal with the Lord." "Well, my territory is different." Brenda saw that she was not testing her and was sincere in the invite. Brenda couldn't help but be extremely honored to the point that even if she was fed poison, she may really take a sip. "Tea, thank you." She was actually being polite and thought that she didn't have the guts to eat and drink too much. It was just that the moment a bite touched her tongue, she couldn't help but eat and drink a bit more. It tasted amazing. The aroma of the cookies and the fragrance of the tea enveloped her senses, carrying her to an unfamiliar world she would love to explore. When her teeth bit into the cookie's crunchy but chewy exterior, a burst of flavors erupted on her tongue, making her want to moan. Then she took a sip of the tea, each drop sending warmth to her body. She immersed herself in the earthy essences of each sip, closing her eyes as her palate exploded with floral undertones, mixed with some natural sweetness of fruit she could taste. She had heard of teas, weren't they supposed to be bitter? Unconsciously, she raised her head to ask the nearby person. When she saw the Lord's beautiful emerald eyes looking at her in amusement, Brenda shivered. Goodness elves, How could she forget that the Lord was right next to her? And she abruptly stood up and bowed at a 90-degree angle. I'm sorry, my lord, she exclaimed, shaking a bit. She wouldn't get fired as soon as she was hired. Ironically, her eyes ended on the plate, and felt reluctant to part with it the most. Althea saw all this and held back a chuckle. I told you to just call me Althea. How could I? Calm down, it's fine, I placed it there to be eaten. But. Althea rubbed her forehead. Obviously, there was a heavy cultural gap between them, and it was useless to teach too much. Do you want to eat the rest or not? She said. If you don't sit back down, I'll take them back. Later. The woman furtively sat back down. Althea waved at the food, and as if doing her duty, the woman resumed her chewing. She did not even notice she was humming a bit, but Althea didn't point it out lest she went into a panic attack. Anyway, from her reaction, she could tell that the NPC loved the food, and this was still using the simplest available ingredients. Anyway, instead of dwelling, she started changing the topic. You mentioned some sort of war earlier. She paused, deep eyes darkening. Tell me more about this territory war. Chapter 102, Territorial Wars, Part 2. Tell me more about this territory war. Althea paused, and has this always been the case? Brenda looked at the Lord's face and saw that she was really not angry. She composed the answer in her head and responded. Territory wars are inter-territory fights that have been happening for millennia. My father had taught me that wars had been going on since the time of our ancestors. It was the natural way of life back then. Plundering, murder, and theft were common practices and were considered common sense at the time, regardless of the race. But the wars had gotten so bad that over half the population died. This was some thousands of years ago, I believe. Led by the elves, the Concordium began and limited the wagging of wars to a maximum of 12 times a year, or once a month. There was also a day required to warn the territory being attacked, so no, there are no real surprise attacks. To some extent, this really allowed respite time for everyone to recover. Concordium, Althea said. What do they do? Where are they now? Brenda shook her head. I don't think they still exist, but the rules set applied to everyone who entered the land. I don't know much about it, we were only commoners after all. Althea didn't bother with this Concordium as she felt it was far from her. On the other hand, she was still very worried about the wars. Won't strong territories just target weaker ones? At this point, Brenda now fully understood that the Lord truly had no idea what was going on in their place. Of course, while it was a mystery how the Lord's people had yet to experience territory wars, it was none of her business. Brenda simply answered as carefully as she could, trying to be as helpful as possible. Territories were only allowed to attack territories of the same level. However, if a territory wants, it can challenge any stronger opponent. Althea nodded. Indeed, if wars could be waged without limit, it would only be endless bloodshed. Wars could be said to be an inevitability for a planet with so many different intelligent creatures. Even in Terran, where only humans were the only intelligent beings, wars had been an unavoidable part of history, let alone when there were so many races. Speaking of other intelligent creatures, she'd have to ask this in detail later on. Then what tray the winnings? Brenda swallowed another piece of cookie. She couldn't help it, it called to her. Regardless of whether the territory was challenged or was challenged, the loser will give up the current half of its assets to the winner. This includes gold, resources, buildings, people, and others. Then she paused, looked at Althea with a bit of reluctance, but still voiced out her thoughts. Unless the Lord themselves are killed and their tokens taken, in which case the territory can be merged with the winning territory. What, but how? The Lord token was integrated into her. It was not a physical item after use, nor was it in space. From her understanding, a used Lord token would not appear until the holder died. And when they did, as what happened with that other guy from Royal Territory, their land will disintegrate with them. I hadn't encountered it personally, but a mercenary I once knew had once been hired to fight for an attacking territory. She looked a bit bitter at the mention of the mercenary she once knew, and Althea saw some history, but Althea was never one to pry. They won, and they managed to get the entire territory. According to him, during the 28 hours of war, the Lord token will temporarily be disassociated with the body, unable to be integrated and placed in the space. It wasn't common knowledge, but it so happened the lord that hired him knew of it and specifically investigated and targeted the enemy lord. Hence, during the time of wars, even if the lord died, the territory would not. Whoever could take the token would get the territory as well. Althea thanked the heavens for her decision to be low-key. Otherwise, in wars, if she didn't trust the people around her, she would not only be afraid of attacks from the outside, but also greedy people who wished to occupy her land. Brenda also realized the advantages of the lord, hiding the lord identity. It was just that she had never known anyone who could let go of the prestige of being hailed, respected, and worshipped that came with the status of a lord. After all, even lords with small villages had a higher status than low nobles in towns. Not to mention, the lord obviously didn't know about the territorial wars before, and yet she made this decision. She was obviously a very wise lord. Brenda was relieved to be under her for the time being. Then Althea looked at the woman. 28 hours is a day, correct? How many days a month? Brenda blinked suddenly, questioning the wise lord image in her head for a moment, but then she remembered they were complete foreigners. 32 cycles, my lord. This confirmed her previous supposition, and was relieved it was really longer than Terran months. It meant she still had 24 days to go. Althea was still absorbing all the information, but it felt like her brain wasn't working very well. Instead, she just asked another issue she had been concerned with. What other creatures are there, other than humans? Orcs, dwarves, goblins, zergs, the undead. There seem to be smaller ethnicities, but I'm not very familiar with them. She looked very distressed as she said so. I'm sorry, my lord. Sigh. Althea couldn't even be bothered to comfort her right now. If those fantasy novels and movies were accurate, then these so-called orcs, goblins, dwarves, zergs, and the undead, and there were also elves, it seemed, would definitely not be easy opponents. Even the NPC wasn't clear about it. How could she prepare for it? Althea rubbed her temples, trying to soothe an incoming headache. What the heck was this place? Chapter 103, A Moment of Respite. 24 days of protection period. Now that she knew what they would face after the protection period, she suddenly felt a deeper sense of crisis. She still hadn't gotten over her little trauma from the last beast tide. Now they had to go through wars, and at least once every month at that. It was only now that she noticed Brenda looking at her worriedly. Althea sighed, unconsciously patting her stomach to calm herself. Her Barbies were responsive and gently kicked from inside, making their presence known, as always. With renewed strength, she opened her alluring emerald eyes that had now regained its calm. She then looked at the woman, who flinched a bit. She started giving instructions, her tone as stable as it could be. Go to the weapon store and focus on creating mid-level weapons, she said. In this way, not only would they have level E weapons, but they could have improved level E and even level D weapons. Of course, the latter was preferred, so she ought to give a bigger incentive. You will receive 1% of the profits for each weapon you make. You will also get more if you innovate. She paused, looking at the other woman, who was already gaping at her in confusion. Althea assumed she needed more explanation. It means that for every weapon you produce, you would get a residual. Further, you will receive a higher share per weapon if you innovate on a weapon yourself. I hope you do so. My lord, Brenda couldn't help but ask again, doubting if she heard it correctly. Althea stared at her and repeated what she said, and how could Brenda dare make her repeat again? Brenda still couldn't believe it. She had never heard of lords giving more to the hired personnel beyond the conditions of the contract. But when she saw the seriousness in Althea's tone, she could only bow her head in gratitude. Yes, my lord. This was such a great honor it would take her the rest of the day to absorb it. Before Brenda left, Althea couldn't help but emphasize, remember, people don't know of my status as the lord. Yes, my lord. Brenda left the room and walked down the flight of stairs, flinching at the heads whipping to her direction. She cleared her throat and continued walking down, heading to the weapons store as ordered, inevitably causing a disturbance to the people using the ground floor. On the other hand, Althea, through the warehouse, teleported back to her room. Her shoulders slumped as she stepped into her room, heaving a sigh, and went to the bathroom to take her bath. She looked at the new earthenware tub, now filled with water from the tap, connected to the tank above. She lit up the fire pit below the tub to warm the water. She really needed a very relaxing bath right now. She was partially in a daze as she prepared her bath, waving her hand along the water as she waited for it to warm, unsure of how to handle all the pressure. A couple of minutes later, she judged that it was warm enough and headed to the counter. She took out an earthenware bottle on the surface, gesturing to put a couple of drops into the bath water. The moment she uncapped the bottle, a gentle fragrance wafted out, lingering in the air. The room was filled with a mix of gentle aromas, carrying promises of relaxation and serenity. Walking towards the tub, she tilted the bottle, and droplets of the scented oil fell from its lip, merging with the clear water below. What she added was her latest floral essence extracted from wildflowers and mixed with a system unnamed plant that smelled like jasmine, and was thus named as such. A contented smile graced her lips as she dipped her hand into the water. The soothing warmth and fragrance of the water was lovely. She shed off her clothes, stepping on the slippery surface of the tub, and sank into the water's warm embrace. As she laid inside the wooden bathtub with her eyes closed, a soft sigh escaped her lips, not wanting to think about the beasts and the wars. Her worries were temporarily carried away by the relaxing aroma and the gentle caress of the water. As her mind drifted, she couldn't help thinking of how the NPCs revered her by virtue of her being the Lord said a lot about the hierarchy here. A society with a sharp hierarchy meant that there was a contrasting concentration of wealth, something she could take advantage of. Althea had always been confident in her products. Her products had always been top par, and her luxury items sold for exuberant amounts. Even in this other world, she believed she would still do well. Thinking of the wealth she could milk out of the nobles here, the feeling of dread about the inevitable end of the protection period softened a bit. A bit biased, she contributed her change of mood to her product, namming it with the apt, calming spring. "Boss is so beautiful," Sheila couldn't help but whisper as the pregnant woman gracefully walked out of her room and joined them on the just-set table. "You smell very nice." "It's a new product, I'll give you one." Sheila brightened. Which woman doesn't love beauty in their core? Old Harold, who was quite dull when it came to all things beautiful, just continued to chew his food, much more interested in the gossip he caught. Someone came down from the second floor. They say it's a woman as tall as a big man. Very strong too, and she went straight to the armory. He paused, finishing a few more bites. "Boss, do you know who it is?" An NPC, who will be in charge of the weapon shop." The men perked their ears in interest, while the children just enjoyed their flavored mashed potatoes. "NPC?" Harold asked, not sure if he heard correctly. Eugene very helpfully explained to him. "It's called a non-player character. Basically a non-Terran." "Yes, it's an aborigine hired through the village center." Althea paused and looked at them strangely. Also, she wasn't the first NPC. There was also one last night, an armor maker. Everyone's probably already asleep at the time, so no one saw him, or at least noticed he wasn't from Terran. I placed him in one of the shops near the center. Anyway, they only had torches and the 2 moons at night. Who would stay up late? At this time, the vibrant nightlife was something exclusively from a past life. For now, anyway. In any case, Eugene brightened at the knowledge of such experts entering their territory. That's great to hear, so it could make more weapons and armor now, right? Housekeeper Harold, as always, focused on certain things first and foremost. How much do they cost to hire? Althea shrugged and told them, getting them to nearly choke. 15 gold a month each, so expensive. The much sought-after permanent residency was 10 gold, and so was the down payment, just determined for the most basic housing unit. "I'll just make sure they're worth it," Althea said apathetically. "I have the choice to rehire them after a month anyway." The topic shifted to the other NPC, and also thought perhaps an armory would also be good. It was Eugene who spoke of differing opinions. "Shouldn't we just improve his working area?" Althea paused and then looked at Eugene with a little admiration. "Very good idea," she said. This way she didn't have to use a building slot that she didn't have, by the way, on the building. Of course, the gossip didn't end there. This time it was Sheila who shared the news. She leaned over, looking quite gossipy, very unlike the timid self she first met her with. There were 100 people who entered the territory this morning, but her face scrunched to a depressed expression, remembering their states and the stories that came with them. And she looked at Althea with a very worried expression. They all looked horrible. It seems that their territory also got attacked by a beast tide. She couldn't help but shudder at the memories of how royal territory was before. Will they attack us too? Althea nodded and told them the truth. Oh, definitely. All their hearts skipped a beat and they gaped at her. Boss, so sure. If my theory is correct, the attack would happen within a few hours of upgrading. Are we going to upgrade, boss? Althea nodded. Very soon. She did not reveal what she found about territory wars, for now, as they already had enough on their emotional plates at the moment. The table was silent for a while, and the children finally noticed the weird atmosphere and blinked their cute little eyes. But ours is better, Maya said, eyes expressing how certain she was. They all broke into smiles. Harold chuckled and he patted her head. Well, our territory is definitely better than that guy's. Althea nodded. That's why we need to strengthen the guards team. Eugene, who was in the military, nodded. The citizens themselves should have a certain discipline as well. We don't want them abandoning the territory in the middle of the crisis, add chaos, and maybe make things worse. Althea smiled. In fact, seeing there were more and more people coming in, she decided to publicize the rules she had set prior. It was said that civilization was born from the delicate mix of freedom and order. Althea completely agreed, and she would definitely make sure her territory was as great as it could be. Chapter 104, Rules and Regulations. Althea stared at her Lord panel for a while, wondering if there was a function that could help her. The new function of the village's center, Rules and Regulations, should be more than just another announcement function, otherwise it wouldn't get its own tab. Before, even at level 1, they could add clauses like no fighting, etc. for a cost, but the end effect would simply alert the authorities, mostly her, and whoever she assigned to the task. What was different after leveling up? A little curious, she raised her dainty arms to activate the tab, and the screen shifted to form another set of tables. To be honest, she hadn't gotten tired of watching this screen shift, which looked like microscope air particles floating around, forming different images after a click. It was quite fascinating. Soon, an image in front of her revealed 2 columns of differing colors. There were rules on the left side and punishments on the right, in their own language. Although the system didn't help them translate the local written language, it was kind enough to do so with their screens. Her emerald eyes skimmed through the texts, studying them, and saw that there was also a row below indicating the amount needed for implementation. Everything was paid. Then again, if she had the convenience of automatically punishing those that wronged the territory, she felt that it would be worth it. Now that we're in this topic, help me formalize some rules, she told the team, who in turn looked at her curiously. However, looking at all of them without professional knowledge on politics and social science, she paused a bit. Fortunately, there was someone who spent her whole life in the field, and she was conveniently right next door. She looked at Harold. Can you call Auntie here as well? She'd definitely be able to help. Harold nodded and went to the neighbors, calling the former politician in. When Mathilda arrived, the adults all sat down the dining table to discuss on the rules and regulations to be implemented in the territory. They brainstormed on what to write and even decided on the sequence. After all, they couldn't scare everyone from the get-go, right? Most importantly, they also took advantage of this time to announce the other rules that would affect everyday life. They reread, revised, and revised again until they finally decided on the initial rules and regulations within the territory. The payment was based not only on word count, but on the details. For example, adding a no-fighting clause added much more than simply no killing, because fighting had a wide breadth and variation. Even the degree of punishment cost differently. She paid a whopping 500 gold for implementation of the initial rules and regulations. Soon, another announcement appeared in front of everyone in the territory, visitors and citizens alike. Welcome to the proud, strong and prosperous Althea village. We aim to create the idyllic sanctuary where all those who stayed can sleep and live well, whilst maintaining the necessary abilities to survive in the outside world. In order to maintain the peace and order within our great territory, everyone within its walls must abide by the rules and regulations as follows. 1. Fighting outside territory designated areas is strictly not allowed, punishable by yellow card, unless damage to others and or the territory was done, in which case see item 2 and 3. 2. Damaging public property is punishable by repair of the item and 1 yellow card. 3. Damaging others' property is punishable by paying 3 times the original objective value of the item. 4. Littering is not allowed in public spaces of the territory, punishable by 10 copper per cubic centimeter of trash. 5. Noise in residential areas are not allowed after dusk, punishable by 10 copper per person disturbed. 6. Loose stones and loose wood resources can be taken without limits. 7. Temporary residents are entitled for 1 kg of free plant, public domain forests, resource every day. 8. Permanent residents are entitled for 2 kg of free plant, public domain forests, resource every day. 9. For 10 copper coins, 1 kilogram of plants, fruits and resources can be foraged per visitor per day. 5 kilograms for temporary residents. 10 kilograms for permanent residents. Gathering more will trigger a payment method of 10 times the normal value of the plants. 10. Temporary residents are entitled for 10 L of free after resource, river or spring, every day. 11. Permanent residents are entitled for 30 L of free after resource, river or spring, every day. 12. For 10 copper coins. Visitors can get 50 L of water per person per day in any of the water sources. Temporary residents may get 100 L, and permanent residents may obtain 150 L. Gathering more will trigger payment requests of 1 copper coin per liter. 13. Uprooting any plants is prohibited, unless expressly allowed by the territory, punishable by 1 yellow card. 14. Trees within the territory cannot be cut without consent, punishable by 1 yellow card and planting 100 tree seeds. 15. Creating chaos and confusion within the territory is punishable by yellow card for minor transgressions and red for major transgressions. 16. Theft is punishable by paying 10 times the cost of the item, the return of the stolen item, and a yellow card. 17. Anything done under questionable morals or at the cost of damaging other people's property, rights, and health will be punishable on a case-to-case basis. 18. Due to the current lack of a prison, mild crime punishments are community service, i.e. unpaid gathering of resources, cleaning duty, etc. Refusal would earn transgressor a yellow card. 19. During attacks on the territory, even under the protection of the walls and sentries, protected citizens shall do their parts. For every 1% loss in the health of the walls, 1 copper coin will be automatically deducted to anyone protected within the territory. 20. All employed personnel shall be required to spend 28 hours per week outside the walls with the intention of training. 21. Standard working hours shall be 10 working hours, including 1.5-hour break, at the discretion of the employer. Overtime pay and night differentials must be practiced. 22. During attacks on the territory, anyone who adds chaos will be punishable by at least 2 yellow cards. 23. Citizens and visitors may report suspicious activities of others in the village center via the information tab. Rewards upon verification will be in units of contribution points. 24. Anyone proven to have intentionally compromised the safety of the territory is punishable by red card. 25. During attacks on the territory, everyone who defends the territory will obtain contribution points equivalent in number to the copper coins awarded by the system. 26. Contribution points can also be obtained by any acts, behavior, and knowledge contribution befitting and adding to the positive growth of the territory. Note: cards are non-physical entities attached to the transgressor systems, non-transferable. Contribution points cannot be traded, sold, or transferred in any way or form. 3 yellow cards are equivalent to 1 red card, punishable by expulsion and blacklisting. Permanent residents may have 1 yellow card waived by paying 100 gold at the village center. Can be done only once per person per month. Remember, staying within the territory will subject everyone under its protection with its rules. There will be no exceptions. The entire territory froze for a good few minutes as everyone read and absorbed the content of the announcements. There were naturally various voices that exploded, a lot of which were negative. One person frowned and murmured, "Attacks on the territory. We have to guard the territory as well, what are the guards for then?" However, there were many more people who agreed, especially those who had experienced other territories and suffered from it. It was them who were first to speak up for the rules. The previous territories charged many times more than this one, and it only had a wooden fence and a small guard team. The large walls and sentries must be expensive to build and maintain, but they're definitely much safer than others. Yes, a few nodded in agreement. It is estimated this 1% actually takes a while to happen. I've been to other territories, the entrance alone is several times that of here. You enjoy this benefit, how can you not follow this little thing? I think it's fair. I think it benefits us all. Who would want leeches in their team? Right, those who disagreed must want to be parasites. I think so too, they probably just want to hide away. Damn, I had transferred with people like that. They pushed a lot of people as shields. Same. Soon there was a change in the direction of the discussion, a lot of which due to the fact that those who disagreed were delegated as someone who only wanted to take advantage. They would be seen as someone who did not want to do any work, while taking the fruits of the labor of others. Which was indeed, actually the case. These few bad seeds had to keep their thoughts to themselves, while the rest discussed the new rules positively. Hey look, we don't even need a labor union anymore. Haha, the territory does love us. What's contribution? I don't know, must be a good thing. Then there were also teasing comments. One man looked at the friend beside him. Hey, they said no littering. He laughed, what if they backcharge? Won't you get negative copper now? Ha. And some were more curious of the new terms. Hasn't anyone noticed the advantages of being residents? Yes, I can't afford permanent residency, but temporary residency here is very, very cheap. We are entitled to some free food and water. What value for money? I feel so stable. I felt like this when I bought a house back in Terran. In this way, the number of residents skyrocketed, to the point that another upgrade was triggered, this time for the territory itself. Althea blinked at the new screen that suddenly popped in front of her eyes. Upgrade requirement for the territory to level 2 has been met. 100 residents, temporary or permanent. 300 consistent population for 3 days. Do you want to upgrade for 100 gold? Yes, no. Chapter 105, Gear Village, Part 1. Aberdeen City, 22 years prior. Upgrade, a sweet milky voice chanted, excited, putting a small smile at the faces of the people around her. They were currently in a small but colourful snack store. It was quite popular, as shown by the occupied tables even in the dead hours of early afternoon. At this time, the young cashier chuckled at the hyper-adorable little girl below the counter, waiting for her grand order of ice cream. Although she and her brother were dressed a bit shabbily, they both had clean temperaments and good looks that people would think they were child actors wearing costumes. Anyway, the clerk just felt she was adorable and added a few more fries into her order. Thank you for your patronage. Yay, thank you, Mr. Tilda. The tray was dutifully taken by an older boy, very handsome, and the girl tottered to follow him to their seats. Thank Yao Wanwan Tilda. Garen smiled as he placed the tray on the table, leaning down a bit. On cue, the little girl gave the older boy a slimy peck on the cheek, which only made him happy. He patted her head and served her food, placing them neatly in front of her and easy to reach, leaving just a bit for himself. The young Althea noticed this and frowned, placing more food on his plate. Wanwan is much bigger than Althea. Wanwan must eat more, she said with finality, and the young Garen couldn't help but pinch her plump cheeks. He did not reject her kindness. His angel had always been very kind. Okay, thank you, Althea, he said, picking up a bite to eat under her stare. Satisfied with his obedience, Althea cutely nodded in approval before eating her own food, happily chewing this rare treat. Her already chubby cheeks puffed as she chewed, and her bright eyes lit up brighter every bite. Garen already felt full watching her satisfied. If he could afford treating her more, he would. Sadly, he was a kid, and there was a limit to how much he could earn. In any case, he thought cleaning up the mess hall every day to get a few more bucks was too worth it. Gear Village, subsidiary village of Feral Town, present. Garen looked through the scope, one of the few surviving tools during the transfer, and stared at the direction of the fog, trying to see if there were any changes whatsoever. Seeing that there was none, his strong jawline tightened, and his eyebrows furrowed deeply. Garen frankly didn't know what to feel. He couldn't eat well since he found out she could be in this place, perhaps getting chased by monsters, suffering from hunger. The image itself made his heart hurt so much that he massacred an attacking mob of monsters by himself. They were currently staying in a village called Gear Village, which was much closer to the fog, along with others. They chose this place because they could watch the fog through the scope anytime they wished. It was also the only village so close to it that survived the massive beast tide. One reason for this was because of its relatively higher altitude and easy-to-defend state. The other was because it was built as a mining village subsidiary to Feral Town. Because it was a mining town, it was also very tightly protected. It therefore had much stronger manpower than the adjacent villages. They were only allowed to rest for a few days thanks to Bart's connections, as non-residents were generally not allowed to stay in the place for long. They'd have to find another way to monitor the fog soon, as they hoped to stay indefinitely. Gil saw his boss sigh, and he understood very well how he felt. He, too, couldn't help but look at the fog every few hours, as if he could see his mother and his sister in there. That fog must be the protection. If we're correct, it should disappear in less than a month. A month in this world was 32 days, judging the explosion of the beast tide as the beginning of the countdown. They had already taken 7 days. This meant they didn't have to be so near the entire time, they only had to get the timing right. While uncomfortable, Garen knew he was right. He could at least make use of this time to strengthen himself and study this world even deeper, so he could protect Althea when they reunite. "Boss, breakfast is ready." Another voice cut through their melancholic moods. They turned their heads to him. It was a man with fair skin and aquiline features, aptly named Eagle. He was also the only surviving person from the logistics team. These months they had gotten into the habit of discussing some investigations during meal times, because they were often up and about, busy, every other time. Everyone was reporting their own tasks. They reported on various areas and aspects of their respective scope. After all, they chose to investigate themselves rather than listen about everything, rather than relying on the word of mouth from the locals, even from Gordy whom they had just met. For example, the time and distance to the next surviving territory, in which case was tens of kilometers away. For example, the level of monsters in the vicinity, which was the average for villages, which was levels 5-10. For example, how many territories around actually fell and what happened to them, which, so far, based on the refugees outside, rose to about as high as 85%. This damage was really big. "I'm afraid people would blame the territories inside," Lewis mumbled, not forgetting Gordy's tragic story. "Perhaps," Garen said, "especially if someone deliberately targeted a territory, in which case that territory would have no choice but to face wars twice a month. This is why we have to be as strong as we could be, and this starts with understanding this world more." The others nodded, and they continued their discussions, with a serious aim to prepare for whatever they may encounter. After all, they had an entire civilization to protect. Chapter 106, Gear Village, Part 2. The reporting continued on for another half an hour. Gordy, as someone who had been in this place for over 20 years, was also quite helpful, adding details in their reports that they otherwise wouldn't have noticed. Although he was a slave for most of his stay in Xeno, he still heard a lot of news, especially in his stay at the mercenary hall. Hearing the detailed reports from the soldiers jogged his memories and some observations he didn't put to heart at the time. In particular, just when the soldiers were trying to figure out a way to get information inside the fog, for instance, using low-level birds and hanging warning messages on their legs, hopping it dropped over destined people. Although papyrus was very expensive, and it was a long shot any information would actually reach Terran hands, it was all they could do. The people inside the fog may not be entirely clueless about what goes on outside. The others turned their heads to him, a bit hopeful. "My territory before was one of the better ones amongst Nova territories. We managed to upgrade our village center just before the protection period was lifted. Our territory hired some aborigines through it. Although it cost us a lot of gold to get information, we did get them. We were also certain of their truthfulness, because they were contract-bound, not to cause disadvantage to the hiring territory." "That is hopeful," Gil nodded, and the others agreed. "Terrans should be richer, right? Nova had undergone extreme disasters. How much cash could they hold?" Lewis mumbled, turning to Gordy. no offense. It is fine, I also hope your people do well, Gordy said, sincere. He looked at the variables in front of him, strong people aiming to protect, something his own people didn't have. Perhaps it would be different this time. Soon it was Vanessa's turn. Her tasks had to do with medicine, and she, with her head held high, spoke next. Her task was to study the treatment methods and their costs. Especially, she was embarrassed when they just transferred here, because a lot of her knowledge no longer applied in this place. However, after months of hard work, she really managed to adapt and do well in her field. This was her pride. The cost of treatment here is very expensive. Although there were no healers here, and if there were, they would likely charge exuberant amounts, there was a pointed lack of medicine. She smiled. I have also found a herb that had hemostatic effects. While speaking, her pair of dark-colored eyes always landed on Garen. She had heard his wife was known for her knowledge in plants. If she were to remind him of that woman, he should at least soften his attitude, right? She never thought she'd put herself so low and start vying to be a substitute, but she couldn't help herself. Vanessa really couldn't sit still anymore. She had begged her father to send her on the same mission as Garen. It had been so long, and she hadn't gotten an inch closer. Her wish of gaining even a bit of attention was doomed to fail, however, as the man only nodded and turned to the last person to report. Finally, it was Eagle's turn, whose investigation direction had to do with logistics. They had tamed a few flying monsters to transfer the ores, he said, looking a bit wishy-washy, which looked stupid on his slightly angular face. How nice it would be to have a tamer. There is a 50% chance of the beasts biting back, Gordy couldn't help but add. I didn't ask you. Eagle selectively ignored this, especially when he recalled something he eavesdropped. His back straightened up, recalling the wistful longing of one of the tamers. If only I had a space stone, we wouldn't have to go back and forth in this weather. He was lost in his memory, which triggered a bit of impatience in his companions. Say it, Lewis mumbled, annoyed. Eagle cleared his throat. I heard a particular interesting piece of knowledge. He paused. He paused a bit too long, so he earned a rather hard pat in the back from Jake to get him speaking. Apparently, he began, as he massaged his beat-up shoulder and sending a glare to the culprit, people need not be limited to 1 cubic meter of space. Everyone's back straightened like his. Their eyes focused as they stared at him, waiting for him to continue. Don't look at them appearing professional, their bright eyes betrayed their excitement. There seems to be a special mineral called space stone. It is very rare, but it could be used to either make accessories or merge in our own space. I hear it doubles it at least. Really? Lewis even stood up and stared at the ceiling, as if a deity was there to thank. That's great, our space is too small. I want one. Me too. Looking at their excited expressions, Gil sneered. If it's so easy to get, we'd have heard of this months ago. Later. They simultaneously turned their head and looked at Gordy to see what he could add regarding this piece of super interesting information. The older man looked a little embarrassed at the passionate attention and cleared his throat. I have indeed heard of this, but I have never met anyone who had one, at least no one announced it. He paused, thinking, recalling all the limited information he had on this item. The only circulating description is that it's a stone that contains the stars, the most beautiful gem in the universe. That's all, Lewis asked. Damn, makes me itchy with curiosity, Jake couldn't help but add. What I do know is that they're very difficult to find, and even more difficult to harvest. He told them, I have encountered countless of missions looking for it, but in my decades of stay, I have only heard it succeed once or twice before. From what I gathered, these precious stones could only be found and mined by goblins. He paused, looking at these new set of masters he had, and only by goblins. Chapter 107, Other Races. Goblins, eh? As a mining village, Geartown naturally had a lot of goblin slaves. It was just that they were all concentrated in prohibited areas, and they had yet to see one up close. Similarly, in other territories, most goblins were also confined in well-protected mining spots. Normal people wouldn't be able to see them at all. In fact, if Geartown didn't just have the most common iron-like metal, their team wouldn't even have the right to stay overnight, no matter how well-connected Bart was. Gear Village was divided into 2 areas. One was the village center, where the accommodations of majority of the population, mostly miners, the guards, their families, as well as guests like them, were located. This was very restrictive in itself, because guests like them could only get visitors' pass and had to pay 10 silver per day. This was not including the inn fees that rivaled those of large towns. They heard a lot of refugees from the adjacent villages that were destroyed came here, but were eventually kicked out due to not being able to pay the visitors' fee. They could imagine the tragic sight of desperate people simply trying to find a safe haven, only to be denied because of people's greed. The other area was the actual mining area, which took up over half of the territory's land. This was strictly prohibited to outsiders. It was heavily guarded and monitored, taking up nearly half of the guard team. This was also where all the goblin slaves were. They turned to look at Gordy, the veteran who had been here for nearly 3 decades. "What do you know about the other races, and how do us humans fare amongst the forces in this world?" Gil asked the old man. They also tried to find out, but this type of knowledge would take years if they didn't have the right channels. Bart was fine, but they feared things would change if he found out they weren't from this world at all by asking too much, so for this they could only ask a fellow outsider. The older man nodded. As a slave of the mercenary union, he had indeed overheard a lot of news through the years. "As far as I know, there has never been a hegemonic force among intelligent beings, even among humans. It's sad, but amongst the human territories, there was always infighting. As for the other races," he paused, recalling his limited knowledge on the matter. "Other than goblins, I have heard of various races like dwarves, mermaids, the undead, trolls, ogres, and elves. The goblins, as you may already know, are small and weak. While rare, you can still see goblin slaves from nobles and central territories. They comprise the most population next to humans in the human territory. They specialize in detecting minerals and ores. Amongst all intelligent beings, no one can compare to them in terms of detecting such things. They said even a goblin child was better than a human expert that studied stones for decades." "What? That's amazing. There must be something to their physiques, then," Lewis mumbled, chewing on something. Gordy nodded. "Goblins also had the strongest fertility, so even if they're the weakest, they could make up for it in numbers. I heard of a small mercenary group from a border village had an unfortunate skirmish with a rare aggressive goblin group. There are still horror stories about the status of their corpses, even until now, many years later." Gordy paused, rummaging his memory, before speaking again. "They're also extremely skilled at digging. I heard their abodes are generally dungeons and caves they created themselves. Next to the orcs, they were the other race who often attacked human territories, especially those with goblin slaves. Feral Town and Gear Village happened to both be territories near the borders of the goblin and dwarf territories. This made them pause. So dangerous. I haven't actually heard a lot of dwarves attacking human territories so far, at least not on this side. Dwarves are known for their ingenious weapons and tools, but they have been enslaved by humans until about 100 years ago, and have gone into hiding since regaining their freedom. They are a small and reclusive race, and I have only heard about a handful of encounters after all these years. Elves were the smallest population, less than 100 per generation, yet the most powerful. They have been extinct for thousands of years, but they were recorded as heroes. Xeno seemed to have also encountered catastrophic events, similar to our planets, and the elves saved the whole continent. My personal theory was that perhaps the reason why several civilizations could be sent here to survive was because of this lasting magic of the elves, but that's just my guess. The undead, I have no idea except they were disgusting creatures that eat live meat. They were pushed toward the barren lands in the northwest, but I hear occasional sightings and fights. With no exception, it was always accompanied by massive losses on our side against this race. That's like zombies, right? Seriously. Mermaids had their own kingdom on the western and eastern seas, though I have no idea how the two kingdoms differed. Lewis couldn't help but look wistful, and he wasn't alone. Are they pretty? What? The mermaids? Gordy looked at him weirdly. From what I heard, they had sharp fangs, white eyes, and aggressive temperaments. Later. Gil rolled his eyes at the fools, and just looked at Gordy, who was being weirded out by their questions. Ignore them and continue. Yes, the old man said. Trolls are also called stone men, basically made of stone, and they live next to ogres known for their green skin and grotesque appearance. The former were peaceful and timid, while the ogres were more aggressive, but somehow the two races worked well together. Because they live in the same areas, they often cross-marry. I had the fortune to see a crossbreed being dragged as a slave. The nobleman who bought this slave paid enough money to build an entirely new village. As for the others, he shook his head. I don't know anything. Gordy stopped and no one said anything, absorbing the new information. It had to be said that in the past 3 months, they had focused too deeply on the way home, that a lot of knowledge had been bypassed. It was around this time that they heard a bit of commotion outside. They looked at each other and went out, to see a line of well-equipped soldiers dragging a long line of goblins. In the past few months, they had only seen a few goblin slaves from afar. This was the first time they actually saw them up close. It was just that, as low-key as they wanted to be in a foreign territory, what they saw made their blood boil. Chapter 108, Goblin Slaves. The goblins were quite small. The largest one was only as tall as their thighs. They had green skins, long noses, and pointed ears. When they looked closer, they could also see that they had pointed fingers, narrow eyes, and rough skins. But what struck the soldiers the most was their state of being. They were ossified from hunger, with countless scars everywhere on their skin, their green flesh further covered by fresh and dried blood. The creatures were currently being dragged by their cruel captors, blood stamping their steps, and marks of heavy abuse visible in their emaciated bodies. Some were hopeless and soulless creatures, while there were few who had bright eyes and fighting spirit. Whatever it was, how could the sight sit well with the soldiers? They're goblin slaves bought from other territories. They overheard someone near them mention to his companion, I heard they were bought for a very high price. What's up with the sudden purchase though? Did the demand for iron increase? Who knows? They couldn't help but look at the goblin getting dragged, marks of blood following their footsteps. Garen frowned. His gut was telling him something troublesome was about to happen. His attention was brought back to the sorry sights when a tottering old goblin met with a harsh whip from the guard. Get moving, he yelled, throwing his whip again, not just hitting the one goblin but everyone around it. The goblins screamed in pain, but they dragged their bodies regardless. Garen and the others clenched their fists in anger. More expressive ones like Lewis had their faces contorted in lividity and indignance. Although they were soldiers, they had lived in a fair, peaceful world. Their special teams were basically the only soldiers who still encountered real danger every few months, and it was only due to rare insurgents and criminal gangs. It was a very rare sight, even for them, to see an intelligent being abusing another to such a degree, so openly and without remorse. But they did not move, still knowing their place. But holding back definitely hurt their bodies, their livers, their heads. Sam even felt like he would have an aneurysm if this went on. A sudden yell sounded then, pulling them away from drowning in helpless self-pity. Hey, come back here, one of the slave drivers yelled at the top of his lungs, pudgy arms pointing at their direction. Soon they realized that one goblin seemed to have escaped. It was going to their side. Stop him, the slave driver yelled, pointing at their group. But none of Garen did anything, and they pretended as if they didn't hear anything. Eagle even blocked the way a little as if by accident. What are you doing? The slave driver asked with a menacing look on his face. Oh, what happened? I was just standing here peacefully, Eagle answered, nonchalant. Veins popped in the slave driver's head, but he didn't have the time to argue. He simply pushed him to the side, but Eagle was not moved. The slave driver narrowed his eyes, but knew this wasn't the time for this skirmish. Instead, he stepped away, cursing, promising himself he'd deal with this bastard after he got that damned goblin. But when he moved, Eagle did too. You? Eagle looked absolutely confused. You told me to move. The escaped goblin was baffled as he sat, but he quickly got up and continued to run. The slave drivers glared at them, and seeing they were standing still, he raised his hand to hit him with his weapon. This will teach why. Slap! A handsome pair of hands gripped on the whip, a bit of blood dripping from the point of contact. I apologize, my friend's ears are not very good, Garen said with a very diplomatic tone of voice, but his hand gripped his whip tightly. Bastards, he yelled, pulling with all his strength, and fell down when Garen suddenly let go. You told me to let go. Why are you? The man turned red and speechless in anger. His posture changed, and was about to attack when another voice from the crowd echoed, making the soldiers frown. Caught him, the person yelled, proud. I caught the rat. Unfortunately, even if their group didn't do anything to help evil, someone else did. The goblin was still caught in the end. It wasn't that they didn't think it would be caught, but it was caught too quickly. Did the people here have no pity for the little guy? The slave driver in front of them sneered as he stood up, sending the two sharp glares. Eagle and Garen were unfazed, however, as if they really didn't have any idea on what just happened. He paid the captor some silver and dragged the poor goblin back to the line, the slave driver's eyes on Garen, sending daggers with his sight. The man then threw the little guy to the goblin crowd, raising his whip to the highest his arm could reach, and hitting it with all his strength. They watched as the goblin was whipped several times until he was half dead. Every Terran had their fists clenched, holding back. These were obviously intelligent creatures with their own feelings and thoughts. Among them, Eagle had already gestured to run to stop the whipping, but was stopped by a firm hand on his shoulder. Eagle chose logistics even when he had good force value. This was because despite his menacing features, he had a very soft heart. He wouldn't be able to kill an enemy at all. Fortunately, the monsters here were only rabid creatures who aimed to kill, otherwise he'd still be level 3 after so many months. Eagle looked at the hand and then to its owner. It was the captain. Of course it was. The man shook his head, stopping him from doing any more. It's none of our business, we already did what we can. But this is wrong. Yes, I know, but we don't have the power to critique other people's worldviews, Garen said with a frown, no matter what, their safety came first. How could they risk meeting their families for strangers, especially those from other races? There was silence in the group, but everyone agreed in their hearts, no matter how unwilling. But then they heard the familiar ping of the system sound inside their heads. Everyone, even those near them, flinched at the same time. Gear Village Human is set to be attacked by Hoko Village Goblin. You have 14 hours to prepare. 13:59:59. Their eyes widened as they looked at each other, startled. An attack? They couldn't be so unlucky, could they? Chapter 109, Before the War, Part 1. Aberdeen City, 20 years prior. The 9-year-old Garen looked bitterly at the locked door of the isolation room, heart filled with anger and indignance. Unfair. Tui. He spit out the remaining blood of that hag out, spitting out again as he tasted the disgusting rusty taste. It tasted as dirty as she was. It landed on the isolation room's dusty cement flooring, just next to the dirty cot he would be sleeping in the next couple of days. It was his 3rd time here this year, and it was only the 2nd month of the year. He just couldn't stop himself. Those women were disgusting. They always watched him with dirty eyes and wanted to touch him. First he just threw a vase at a visiting rich woman, the 2nd time he punched the volunteer in the face, and now he bit off the flesh of the vice principal. The vice principal angered him the most. She was supposed to be their mother. How could she think of him that way and try to sell him off to others? It was too disgusting. He didn't even feel the hurting stomach due to the kick, and neither could he feel the bruise on his shoulder. He just needed them in pain. He didn't care about his hunger and thirst either. He had no regrets. They deserved it. He was just a little worried that Althea would cry again while looking for him, but he had already told his friend to take good care of her and reassure her. Recalling Althea's cute face filled with bean-shaped tears, looking so heartbreakingly pitiful, he started to regret his impulse a little, after all. But what could he do? He could only hope that his friend would be able to keep her from trouble. He suffered like this in the isolation room for a few more days, receiving just enough food and water not to rot there and die. However, when he finally came out, he ignored his weakened self from hunger, and he immediately ran to the dormitories to check on his angel. On his way there, he encountered Beanie, a good friend of theirs, and the person he asked to take care of his angel. But without speaking, the flabby brat ran to him and shook his shoulders. Annoyed, he pushed him off. What? But when he saw the rare seriousness in Beanie's eyes, he felt his stomach drop. What happened? He asked, looking around, praying it wasn't as he thought. Where's my Althea? Beanie looked at him and gritted his teeth, flushed from shame. I'm sorry, I swore I looked away for just a few seconds. Just get to the point, he yelled, the last thread of patience snapping. Althea's gone, Beanie yelled back in fear, crying in guilt. It's been half a day. It felt like he fell from a building and splattered all over the ground. Present. Garen coolly looked at his subordinates, gesture exuding calmness and strength. His sharp eyes watched in apathy as the chaos all around him exploded due to the imminent war. After all, like them, a lot of these people weren't citizens here at all. Eagle frowned and looked at the tense surroundings. "What do we do, boss? We're not allowed to leave," he said, not believing their bad luck. The village had just entered a martial law where no one was allowed to leave the territory. They had been here for 3 months, but they had only really been around Twin Winds, a very strong town. Not only did it rarely get attacked, but when it was attacked, it always won. They had never participated in the wars in this place, not in the real sense. But look, they just stayed here for a day, and they were already getting dragged into one. "Get out of the way, there's obviously still time." A commotion particularly louder than other caught their attention. It was 2 mercenary teams trying to get out the door. However, rather than look scared, they looked annoyed. More likely, it wasn't that they were scared of whatever was attacking, but that wars were too troublesome, and it was not worth the trouble. The mercenary team consisted of about 20 or so members, all of whom were large in stature, and had sneering, angry expressions on their faces. Similarly, the guards had several builds, looking very annoyed at these bastards making their jobs harder. "If you leave, you will be blacklisted." Another guard added, "If you really want to leave, one person pays 100 gold. "What, are you insane?" a mercenary roared. The defensive stance of the guards were forced to be more aggressive as more moves were exchanged. The guards were naturally arrogant in their own way, looking down at the damned men causing the headaches. "Cowards," he said, "afraid of rats." At this sneer, someone finally snapped and threw a fireball. This was the catalyst of the skirmish of elements that ensued. Bursts of elements exploded, hitting one another. An earth spike flew to hit a guard, which was blocked by an earth wall. Then another mercenary threw fireballs, hit by guards with their water whips. Similarly, most men, the non-elementals, also joined in the fight, but they had a separate fight altogether. Those that were gifted with the elements used their abilities to attack, either missing or deflected, destroying the facade of the buildings. If system buildings didn't have inherently strong structures, the houses would have been taken down by now. This was an exchange that consisted of scores of men, creating a morbid but beautiful sight. While most of the others panicked, trying to avoid becoming collateral damage, those from Terran were fascinated. Why? Because it was very rare for them to see so many other elementalists in action. Unless you were a family or clan member or an apprentice, the chances of learning knowledge and technique from an expert was almost nil. But in front of them is a tutorial. Chapter 110, Before the War, Part 2. After trying to study on their own, they finally found a live tutorial. Still, most of the elements were available for show. One must know that these mercenaries and special guards averaged at level 20s. The powerful mercenaries were here because they were purchasing iron in bulk orders to be used by their large mercenary regiments. The guards were strong because most of them grew up in towns, primarily Feral Town, the master territory of this village. Naturally, their average level was in the 15s and 20s. Such a fight was really too rare in a village. Anyone who was anyone in the industry were elementalists, but this was still not a big percentage. They didn't know their group, which had 100% elementals, was so rare before. Fortunately, it wasn't too rare that their existence was suspicious. It just seemed to add a strong background for them. In any case, it was fortunate for them to develop this ability. It had saved them countless times. Without their elements, they wouldn't have lasted for so long. However, regardless of talent, they had only practiced these skills for a month or two. The passage of knowledge in this world was incredibly closed. As mentioned, unless a family or clan member, or an apprentice, the chances of learning knowledge and technique from an expert was almost nil. Everything they knew, they learned by themselves, and, if they were lucky, they could watch other elementalists such as ones from the Roland mercenary team fight, and maybe learn a thing or two by watching. But now, they could watch fighters in level 20s duke it out, very closely, and still as spectators. It could be said to be the best learning experience they had thus far. They watched as flames danced around the fire elementalists, and the gust of winds swirl around the wind elementalists. They admired as the earth elementalists' feet merged with the ground, and whistled at the seemingly endless water dripping from the hands of the water elementalists. They watched as one of the fire elementalists let flames burst in his hands as he lunged forward, sending fiery projectiles towards the guards. They watched as a wind elementalist guard, with a swift motion of his hands and arms, formed a wind shield, deflecting the attack to some degree. The earth elementalist guard stomped the ground, causing a couple of rocks to jut out, killing the fireballs that passed the wind shield. This was followed by a counter-attack from the guards, also defended against by the mercenary, and so on. This went on for many minutes, and the Terrans couldn't help but make commentaries on the side. "You can really fly with the wind element." Sammy, the dark-skinned soldier from the south, patted whoever was beside him excitedly. Jake, the one being beaten, pushed him back, but the smile on eyes while watching the fight was bright. "Turning the ground to quicksand, that's cool." Similar never-seen-the-world expressions echoed in their group. It was a little embarrassing, but who told them to have no choice but study their abilities on their own? Actually, they thought too much. After all, most people weren't elementalists at all, so it wasn't actually too childish. If anything, people would admire them for understanding what was going on. He delayed the ignition of the fireball. "You can add spikes to vines, eh? How?" Turbo, a water elemental, was inspired when he saw the water whip trouble a wind element. Everything it hits the face, although the power was weak, it was distracting enough. He thought, what if he could control it to stay on an opponent's face? Wouldn't that cut off someone else's oxygen supply? The fight continued on for a few more minutes when the ground suddenly shook. It was at this time that two huge walls blocking the two sides, somehow stopping a brunt of the attacks. It was Barton, the Lord of Gear Village, and a level 30 powerhouse. He looked about mid-30s despite his much older age. He only had a small streak of white hair that may betray his age, wearing an expensive attire from one of the cloth cities. He stood between the two forces, standing tall and intimidating. "Hoko Village is a goblin village. You think we'll lose to a mere goblin village?" he bellowed, causing everyone to pause. "Although they have great numbers, they're the weakest race in the continent," he continued, looking each of them in the eye, intimidating them. This included the spectators, and not just the mercenaries or his guards. Not to mention, wars can only be fought at the same level. How can Gear Village compare to other villages? This made the people who were worried relax a little. Indeed, even powerful villages generally have talents no more than level 15. Where can you see another village with a level 30 lord? Seeing that the crowd calmed down a little, Barton's sharp eyes turned to one of the leading mercenaries attacking his guards. "Lowell of the Mighty Bear's mercenaries." "That's me," the man answered, pompous. Even if the man is several levels higher than he was, he refused to show weakness. Fortunately, Barton didn't seem like he called him out to find fault. "I believe your home base, Georgian Town, was also attacked by goblins, yes?" The man paused and frowned, not liking the information revealed. However, Barton sent him an amicable smile. "Can you tell us in detail about their style of warfare? We will reward you generously." Lowell looked at the older man warily, but realizing that he was serious, along with the very real attack coming soon, he eventually gave in. "Goblins are known to be great diggers." Barton paused, his tone grave and filled with distaste. "They built a lot of tunnels and traps, and they could do it very quickly and subtly." He looked away, a little ashamed. "We almost lost because of this particular ability of these rats." Everyone listened closely, startled. A small town was threatened. What about them, a village? Everyone looked at him in apt attention, dedicated to listening to what he had to say. They dared not underestimate the goblins anymore. Chapter 111, Soldiers. Aberdeen City, 21 years prior. Garin crossed his arms and watched in befuddlement as his little angel walked around, dragging several ducklings with a rope. She was adorable, but he also felt a little pity for the ducklings being dragged. "What are you doing, Althea?" he asked, leaning down so they were in eye level. "Are you sure you're not hurting them?" No, Garin," Althea corrected him patiently, looking like a cute little adult. "This rope is used to guide them." "You don't know, they're so stupid." Her cute eyebrows furrowed and her chubby cheeks puffed as she spoke. "They would jump out to the road if I didn't do it." She then looked at him with all the seriousness she could muster. "I saved them, like a hero." Garin held back his smile, patting her head. Yes, ropes saved their lives." He chuckled. "My Althea is amazing." Gear Village, present. Garin watched as the lord of the territory gathered information about their imminent enemy with seriousness. Before Bart left to go back to Twinwave, He told them a bit about the lord of this village. Garin could still remember that they were a bit surprised to find out that the Lord, Barton, was already in his 70s. He looked to be only in his 30s. After thinking it through, it made sense. People here had an average lifespan of 100 years. Stronger people of levels higher than 20 can reach 150 years, not to mention level 30. Goblins' fecundity was strong, but their lifespans were much worse than humans, with an average lifespan of 40 years. Of course, these were for slaves. Free goblins never subject to slavery were estimated to be able to live a decade or two longer. Of course, no matter how long the lifespan, it didn't matter if you couldn't keep your head. Barton and his assistant listed down Lowell's advice on how to handle goblin attacks. They discussed it among themselves for a while. There were plenty of arguments between the underlings, most of which was the assignment of the vanguards, to the point of a fight almost breaking out. But Barton shut them up by assigning which guards and soldiers would be the vanguard. He had a very strong presence, and no one dared argue with him at all. Soon after, the entire territory mobilized everyone for a fee. Garin and his team also helped. Although they didn't know how they'd handle the actual goblins, they could at least help reinforce the defense of their side against them. They did not agree on how humans dealt with goblins, but they definitely wouldn't betray their humanity for them, either. Lowell stepped forward to further detail his experiences with goblin wars, looking as if he was disgusted by the idea of goblins themselves. These things are the worst bugs you could imagine. They could dig as quickly as they could crawl. Once the war starts, they would definitely start digging somewhere inwards. In a short span of time, they could create a complex network of tunnels and traps, taking away our advantages in size and skill. To deal with this, everyone was asked to dig deep ditches, relatively deep, about 2 meters in. The rare elementalists did a lot of the work in this, and thus gained a lot of money than the others. Stakes were placed inside these, so the enemy diggers would be stopped at a certain distance from the wall, ideally to be handled before they got too close. Similarly, deep and sharp stakes were stuck in the ground to serve as underground gates. They added deeper spikes that would vibrate and warn those above ground if there were suspicious movements underground. Other than these, there were plenty of other ground traps that goblins, with their limited vertical size and strengths, would have difficulty coping with. Barton looked satisfied with what was happening to the village, and soon excused himself and left the rest to his men. The Terrans watched as the entire village and visiting mercenary teams mobilize with full force to defend against the goblins. Garin and the others felt complicated. The goblins would face a helpless massacre, wouldn't they? The group felt heavy at the thought of the oncoming massacre. It wasn't that they even considered betrayal. After all, they were ultimately on the human side. It was just that no matter where, no matter who, useless killing was something that bogged them down. They were soldiers, and because of this, they were particularly caring of life, despite being willing to sacrifice one's own if needed. Were they really just going to watch this massacre happen helplessly? It was here that Garin noticed a soldier hailing their tamed mounts to a different position, held by ropes. The creatures were a little unwilling, but had no choice but to follow. His cerulean eyes fixed on the ropes, and an idea dawned onto him, recalling that short but lovely memory of his Althea and her ducklings. "Hear my orders," he said with that baritone voice of his, and his subordinates instinctively straightened their bodies to listen in response. "Gather as much rope as you can," he told them. "I have an idea." The rule of territory wars was that the winner would receive 50% of the territory assets, and this included all resources, including humans. However, this only referred to those within their enemy's home territory. That was to say, if one side could keep the attackers and their assets, the winning side could get a lot more than 50%. In the same way, individuals participating in the wars could get a chance to receive the loot from the losers. This was what Garin and the others were targeting. However, asking for loot was one thing. Asking for the very expensive goblins was a whole other thing. At the very least, even Gordy had never heard of it being done before. A few hours before the attack was set to begin, Garin approached Barton, who was then surrounded by a few mercenary leaders and their henchmen. "Lord Barton," Garin said, making the standard salute, placing their dominant hand on their chests. As long as they didn't have to bow or kowtow, this little thing to show standard respect didn't matter to them. "You are, Garin, yes," he said, remembering this person was introduced by Bart himself. Despite his level, he caught the attention of Bart and the others, which said a lot about this person's ability. Yes, my lord. What's the matter? I have a bit of a request. He paused. Lord Barton said before we can keep the loot of the creatures we killed, in addition to 10 silver for every goblin killed, yes. That is correct, he said, and the others were also looking at him curiously, wanting to see what he wanted to ask for. We would like the exchange, these for the right to sell all the goblins we capture alive. An awkward silence passed by the space. Barton was a bit surprised, and he looked at this young man deeply. However, the young man said it out loud, and a lot of the others were waiting for his answer. Before he could speak, Garen continued with his soliloquy. They are considered dead the moment they attacked your good territory. Instead of the gold, I would appreciate it if the Lord would be so kind as to allow me to make a bit of a living out of this. Garen had grown up well past the prideful arrogance from the past. He had evolved to be someone who could bend and stretch. Even if he didn't look up at the nobles here, he could give them the minimum respect they expected to receive. He knew that lives were more important than his arrogance. Barton was silent for a while. This was highly unusual, because generally, if people were spared in wars, they were automatic properties of the Lord. More importantly, goblins who had begun fighting would never stop doing so. They would never be slaves, as they would definitely take their own lives if they were captured. In his long years, no goblins with fighting spirit had been caught. Almost always, they died before they could get dragged into human territory. He sighed. Fine, he said, looking nonchalant. Then he walked away, not giving the chance to the others to ask for similar requests. Garen knew he made things awkward for this lord, so he excused himself to focus on their next tasks. He did not notice the same lord pausing his steps and looking back, sharp eyes sticking on him. Boss, our spaces, except for some emergency supplies, are now filled with tools for captivity. Logistics Officer Eagle reported, a little excited. It had been a while since they'd done something worthy of their status as soldiers. Pity the space was too small, or else they could have bought more. Garen looked at each of the soldiers, obviously looking forward to this rescue mission. He could understand their mood. All this time they had no choice but to focus on themselves and on their survival. Because of their weak strength, they had no choice but to simply watch the incredible amount of injustice around them. They could only watch when weaker people got abused and beaten up in front of them, commoners got exploited by nobles, and experience the overall injustice that was the common practice in this world. But they couldn't do anything, because they knew prying would mean certain death. It was logical and understandable, and very necessary for survival, but it shamed them to death. It was a feeling oftentimes even worse than death. But now they could actually do something worthy of their title. They could finally stand upright and say proudly, with all their might, they are soldiers. Chapter 112, Capture Part 1. 000000. Attention to Gear Village. The territory war has begun and will end in 27:59 hours. Right on time, a loud horn reverberated across every inch of the territory, and every person within the walls immediately got as tense and ready as they could be. The light of the temporary teleportation array lit up 100 meters away from the walls. To the locals, it was not unfamiliar as they had been attacked every few months or so, but the Terrans, who had been staring outside some time before the timer stopped, watched in awe. They had never encountered teleportation arrays before. There seemed to be some patterns appearing about 100 meters away from the walls before the counter stopped, and then the patterns abruptly lit up when it did. It was like shining water suddenly flowing on engraved surfaces on the ground. This was followed by a bright light that projected upwards from these patterns, appearing as if they were curtains that extended to the clouds. The blinding light lasted for a few seconds, and as soon as it dimmed, the forms of the creatures transporting were revealed. The little things were dense and plenty, surrounding the walls with aggressive faces and their weapons raised up high. Those who had been standing gallantly over the walls paled at the sight of endless waves of goblins. They were more than they anticipated. They were like ants, ready to eat them whole. There were thousands and thousands of goblins that showed up at their doorsteps, forming a large formation outside the gates. Most villages could have a maximum capacity of 20,000. Did they send the whole population to attack? They must be receiving help from a larger territory. Someone yelled, getting a little nervous. Another one answered him, eyes staying on the approaching killer wave. Outside assistance during wars is limited, at most only 1,000 or so goblins. Other than a level cap, only 10% of the average comprehensive strength of the territory since its establishment was allowed to assist in wars. Yes, but we are only a few thousand humans in here. Not to mention, because the goblin slaves still counted as population, the humans in the territory were only half of the attacking goblins. It doesn't matter if they are 50,000 or 100,000, Barton said with his low voice as he noticed the momentum wavering. They are weak and small, and they cannot connect with the elements. It is a well-known fact that a normal-level human could deal with a handful of goblins without a problem. More importantly, we have prepared well for their attacks. There is simply no need to be intimidated. At the rational voice of their lord, the people once again calmed down. Right, the Lord is wise. The Lord is wise. They once again reminded themselves that humans were much stronger than these rats, not to mention they were in their home territory. And the Lord was very right, they were very well prepared to go against them. Their pride was already hit by all this effort they had to spend. It was shameful to still be afraid in this junction. With more confidence, the people watched closely as at least half of the goblins disappeared into the ground, hopefully approaching their traps and falling to their deaths. They watched as the flags vibrated, which signaled the start of their fight. Attack, one of the captains said, and the assigned fighters jumped down. They were quick to stab designated areas with their long iron spears. Squelch, stab, squelch. Judging by the fresh blood that coated their weapons, they definitely succeeded in killing a wave of goblins. However, there were too many green rats, and eventually some started to pass through to the gates. The commotion also eroded a lot of soil, letting these soldiers fall down the pit. Help! They would not be able to utter more than a few words, as they were immediately swarmed by the green creatures, stabbed and killed almost as soon as they landed. The swarm soon went past the first obstacle, both under and above ground, leaving a trail filled with blood of humans and goblins. The wave reached the wall, using their picks and weapons to try and erode it little by little. Of course, level 3 walls, the archery teams, and the sentries every few hundred meters weren't decorations either. While the wall lost a few percentage of life, another wave of goblins was killed. As expected, although the goblins were fighting bravely, it seemed that they were still no match for the strength and preparations done by the humans. Garen and his team took up an area of battle. They made sure not to interfere with other people's good deeds as well. The soldiers were trained with various martial arts, even support roles like Vanessa and Eagle, and they could indeed handle the weaker goblins with relative ease. Except from when they formed a damned wave, in which case elemental techniques were indispensable. Earth users used earth walls to confine the goblins, forming walls above 2 meters with coordination to each other. After making sure the walls were stable enough, the soldiers would then throw in things like sleeping powder or paralysis powder, bought from Bart, quite expensive, inside the boxes. They would simply need to wait until the goblins lose consciousness, and they would get scores of goblins. Fire users used their fires to direct the goblins to their traps, or let them faint in mild heat stroke. And water users, excited to try out their new skills, used water to temporarily cut off oxygen supply and made them faint. In fact, the damage to the goblins had been so minimized that they themselves, the soldiers, had more wounds instead. Some of the goblins noticed this, then they shifted their attacks to the mercenaries and locals of Gear Village. Who wanted to be humiliated like that by those humans? They'd rather die for their pride. The soldiers trying to save them. Don't jump into your deaths, damn it. Chapter 113, Capture Part 2. This went on for hours on end. There were piles and piles of corpses on the ground, adding layer after layer as time went on. Especially the goblins who, if no longer moving, would most definitely be dead. Although some teams did try capturing goblins, the little things went insane when they realized their plans. The goblins' suicidal attacks went wilder, resolute to die than be captured. Who could blame them? Living as a slave was indeed a life worse than death. But the Terrans couldn't exactly announce they were there to save them, right? It was this point, along with the stark contrast amongst human corpses, that alerted Garen. Some only had a lethal wound or two, while the others were completely unrecognizable, butchered, skinned, or anything similarly gruesome. It was one thing to succumb, well, relatively, when caught, but the attack style seemed a bit different. He noticed that goblins killed most people quickly when they could, but there were certain people who were particularly miserable. For example, there were people like the slave drivers who died a very gruesome death. Their eyes were poked, and their bodies stabbed thousands of times. From their faces plastered with expressions of agony, he could tell they suffered a lot while breathing before finally given the luxury of dying. For instance, the man who whipped the old goblin and went after the escapee was particularly horrid looking. His body was dismembered, the bones and sinew visible from their angle. Lewis vomited, some splatter landed on Gil's shoes. Shame, Gil frowned in disgust, resuming the task at hand. They also noticed that the goblins didn't seem to have much aggressiveness for them, bypassing them directly increasingly often. This did not affect their progress though. If anything, it accelerated their progress. It could be said a good part of the attackers were caught by them. It was just that their ropes and medicine were running out, and it was estimated they would have to stop soon, lest they lost everything instead. Not long after they heard a wave of screams coming inside in territory. Many of the humans around looked at each other in puzzlement. What's going on? The yells got louder and more pronounced, and many people outside who weren't dealing with goblins ran to the gate to see what the heck was going on. As if hearing their questions, the screams became louder and more lucid, and they soon had an idea what was going on inside the walls. Goblins. The slaves, they've escaped. Curious, a couple of wind users lifted themselves up to the battlement, seeing the chaos within. Apparently, the newly caught hundreds of goblin slaves inside had somehow escaped from imprisonment. They were now fighting with the main force within the walls, increasing the chaos, taking another set of human lives. Over half of the forces had now gone outside the walls. No one expected an attack from the inside. Kill them. Don't let them deeper into the territory. If these green rats managed to get to the mines and set the thousands of goblin slaves inside free, then they would really be in trouble. Could things get any worse? As if hearing their question, the ground near the gate suddenly shook, and so did their hearts. Boom! Boom! While the interior of the village was in chaos, the people from outside suddenly started yelling in shock and despair. The goblins had a dwarven weapon. What the heck is going on? Why are they so crazy? They hadn't fully absorbed what they were hearing yet when another earthquake shook the area. A lot of people near the walls lost their footing, some even fell from the battlements. The people turned their heads to the direction of the explosion to see that the gate was destroyed. The people ran to where the major damage was, weapons up, only to see a 10-meter large weapon rolling, crushing everything in its path. It was a heavy weapon that had a tube attached to it. Large rocks came out of it, like the catapults from the cities, but more powerful and quicker to recharge. Soon it reached the wall, hitting it incessantly, eventually cracking it. The weapon dealt massive damage to the territory, hitting dozens and dozens of humans, crushing them to death with the rocks as large as a person. It did not take long for that section of the level 3 wall to fall down. People's hearts dropped to the bottom. One must know that during territory wars, territories could not do any sort of construction at all. They could only watch helplessly as the thousands of bloodthirsty suicidal goblins entered the territory, consuming every human being in their path. While this was ongoing, a group of goblins, the slaves from before, happened to cross paths with them. There were only a handful of them left, but they all had that fighting spirit in their eyes. The soldiers looked at each other, and they nodded at the same time. While there was chaos and the sound of killing around them, the Terran elementalists summoned their powers to deal with the goblins, an overkill, but it was because they wanted this done quickly without hurting anyone, or any goblin, for that matter. They happened to have one last batch of capture weapons remaining, just right. Soon, the machine rolled inside to shoot at other bulks of people, crushing more people. A lot of people tried to deal with it, only to be crushed by its stone wheels. However, when the people nearby were losing hope, their lord appeared like the powerful hero he was in his mind. Barton appeared, jumping from manifested rock to another, and with a large boulder directly killed a group of goblins. It also blocked the attacking mechanism of the weapon, allowing the people to deal with it. It's gone, it was a consumable, that was their last hit, Kill them all, he yelled, and he did his best to counterattack, really not expecting he had to make a move himself. As such, as valiant as the goblins were, and how well they fought this time, it took only an hour for the tide to completely shift to the humans. The goblins, more and more, could only wait to be slaughtered, but they did not give up. They continued to fight, without showing an inch of fear. However, what was crazy was that even if they were losing, there was no sign of them trying to escape at all. It was as if they were determined to die there, and the Terrans could only sigh in pity. There was only so much they could do, and they had already reached their limits. Garen's deep blue eyes followed the massacre that came after, heart heavy. He could only hope that their future wars wouldn't be so bloody. Chapter 114, Suspicions. Thousands of goblin corpses and humans covered the soil. Whether it was outside or inside the walls, blood and body parts of two very different races littered the ground. Ironic how the only way these two races could be seen together was if there was blood involved. The sight of corpses, humans or goblins, splayed out so miserably made their eyes burn. It was not just a troubling sight but a depressing one. The Terrans always felt it was an unnecessary fight. The locals were even more indignant. Although not unusual in territory wars, the fact that they had fought and lost so much to an inferior race was extremely humiliating for them. Hence, even after several hours after the war, some people kicked the goblins' bodies out of anger. In Garen's team, only a handful were left in the village, the rest staying with the captives somewhere else. They feared they'd all be mobbed and stabbed to death by the bitter citizens who had lost too much in this battle. From what they've been hearing, they had never lost before, let alone lost so badly. The Terran soldiers looked at each other and sighed. Wars between nations in their time had long been over. They may be soldiers, and their hands covered with blood, but those were all criminals and terrorists. The world was better without them. What about this? There was even a young girl that died due to the explosion of the door. There was an old man who got burned by a missed fireball. There was also a pregnant woman who was crushed by the so-called dwarven weapon. This was a real war, where innocent lives splayed the ground everywhere. While looking at the battlefield in melancholy, they saw a mighty group of people approach them. It was the Lord Barton and about a dozen cohorts. The man looked at their group and frowned when he saw there were only a few of them. They looked quite imposing, and only Barton didn't look at them with sharpness, at least on the surface. "Where are the goblins?" he asked. A little alarm bell rang in their ears, making their bodies a little stiff and guarded. However, Garen didn't express any of it on his face. Instead, he looked at the Lord unfazed and answered in a calm tone. "We secured them outside, as we are afraid of any revenge attacks from the survivors. What's wrong, my lord?" Barton paused, narrowing his eyes, trying to figure out if he was making excuses. It was not that he often didn't follow his own words, but there was no way. He heard this group actually managed to catch a lot of goblins, an unprecedented feat. He had just received the wins from the war, and he only received 100 gold. That was a chump change, especially considering the damage these rats made. How could he be reconciled? "I want them, I'll pay you more than the market price," he said, introducing the compromise. In his words, he wanted to make money out of these captured goblins, so he was technically not going back on his words. However, Garen and the others frowned. They knew the reason this lord agreed with his request was because he didn't believe they'd be able to capture goblins alive. They looked at the aggressive-looking cohorts and knew they reported their moves to this lord. Naturally, Garen would not give the goblins up at this juncture. "I'm afraid that's not possible." The locals looked at him in disbelief. Barton frowned deeply while his cohort yelled out, "What?" Our team had already left. They were worried some escaped goblins will run after us, so we ran even faster. The other were silent. "Really?" one man sneered. "It seemed to me like you were friendly with the goblins." "It seemed like you helped them out just yesterday, right?" Garen frowned at his reaction. For a moment, he thought they were being suspected as traitors. However, from what he gathered the past few hours, there was no need to be suspicious of any of them, but they didn't want them to think they were out of trouble. Garen stood there, staring at him, as if he would say another truth if he stared harder. "We helped them because we were planning on buying the slaves, but the war happened. Our researchers found that being good to the slaves significantly increases their productivity." Lord Barton's shoulder relaxed a little, and he looked at him in interest. "Oh, mind telling me more?" Garin nodded, doing the standard salute to nobles. Studies showed that giving even the slightest bit of better treatment could increase productivity and loyalty of these creatures by a significant amount. For instance, allowing for a break 10 minutes longer, giving a few spoonfuls more of their food, among others. "I see," was all he said, but then he looked at the group deeply, trying to figure out the truth of this. They cannot be called back. "Yes, I apologize." "Very well," he said, tone unchanging, and even Garin did not know what he meant. In the end, he just turned away, ignoring his existence. Garin and his team watched the other group leave, staring back at some of the cronies who were looking back, looking at them menacingly. When the other group left, so did Garin's, heading towards the meet-up spot. As such, at least for now, they left safely with hundreds of goblins in the guise of selling them. But a few people, including some from Barton's party, were not reconciled. Garin could tell their small-mindedness from miles away. Of course, unless they had killing intent, they wouldn't try to fight to the death either. After all, they were still on the side of humans. There may come a time they would have to give up the goblins. If it really came to that, there was no need to feel guilty. They had done enough for them. But this was the worst-case scenario. They would still want to save as many lives as they could.